Hey everybody, hope everyone's keeping well during this global pandemic situation. Doing something a little bit different with the podcast today. I've been getting a lot of questions from people in the corporate communications realm asking how can we communicate more effectively during this crisis. So what I've done today is I'm bringing together two veteran communicators who are both very good friends of mine, and you're going to hear those two conversations played one after the other. So the first one is with Heather Spidell, the principal of Heather Spidell Consulting in Halifax, Nova Scotia here in Canada. And the second is John Perenack, who is the principal at StrategyCorp, a crisis communications, government relations, and management consulting firm here in Toronto. And I just want to say to all those communicators out there who are working around the clock, who are frazzled, who are maybe working from home with kids running all around your house, it's very interesting times, but we will obviously get through this, and this too shall pass. Hopefully there are one or two ideas that you can take and to understand that you're not alone in this. Anyway, here are my conversations with Heather Spidell and John Perenack. Okay, so very pleased to have Heather Spidell join me. Heather, how are you doing?
I'm okay. I'm concussed, but all is well.
Do you want to tell that story, or should we just skip over that?
No, we'll skip.
Okay. Anyways, so I hope you're feeling better.
Thank you.
So why don't you just take 30 seconds and introduce yourself to people, talk about your history and your career in corporate communications and kind of what you're bringing to the table here today.
Sure. First of all, I'm really glad you're doing this, Warren, and it's very generous of you. We've worked together in the past, and it's nice to stay connected. I started my career working in a children's hospital in communications, and then I went on to the private sector where we met up at a national insurance company, Maritime Life, and we were working together and managing corporate communications for offices across the country. I've worked with the provincial government and actually worked with the Nova Scotia Department of Health during H1N1. So I'm freelancing now, and I guess I really have a passion for employee communications because I believe they're at the front lines. And if you communicate with your employees effectively and support them, then you're going to be effective communicating with your constituents, whether they're customers or patients or partners, suppliers, whomever.
So thank you very much for making the time to chat. I do appreciate it. I know everybody is, while it might not be business as usual, everyone has things on the go and family commitments and all that. So I do appreciate it. One of the reasons I wanted to speak with you specifically, you mentioned employee communications. And to me, as I'm watching all these companies communicate, that seems to be one of the first audiences that they're kind of dropping the ball on. You know, everyone wants to protect those revenue streams, talk to their customers, their clients, their members. And employees are sometimes an afterthought. You seem to think, or some of the information you've put out there is that that's one of your most important audiences, and you actually have to speak to them first. Why do you think that is?
You absolutely have to speak. Well, they deserve it for sure. And most value statements for businesses talk about open and transparent communications and valuing their employees. And in a crisis, our values and our principles are often tested to the max. But this is the time where you really need to focus on communicating clearly, openly, and sincerely with your employees. And really, I'm a big believer in showing empathy. This crisis brings out fear and anxiety in a lot of people. They're worried about their jobs. They're worried about their health. They're worried about their families. And so you've got to be really paying attention to that and communicating not just facts, not just business decisions, but also communicating with care and compassion.
What's your advice for trying to reconcile those two things? You mentioned there's a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety. People are concerned about their family, their friends. Maybe they have relatives or loved ones who are not feeling well or are immunocompromised. How do you do a good job as a communicator at the same time? And a lot of these people are working remotely. They're working from home. They're having tremendous asks from management. They're working around the clock. How do you keep those two things together?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Warren. I think based on my experience and having been in kind of different crisis situations, I know that, and we also know from employee satisfaction surveys that employees trust information from leaders and managers more than, many other forms of communication. So this is a time really to pull on those managers of staff and have them communicating with their employees. I think that's really key. And I think it's also key at this point in time to move quickly and for leaders to be visible. Use tools, use ways of communicating that are basically human, showing leaders communicating with their employees. Mm-hmm. Electronic communications is great, but people at a time like this want to see leaders communicating as human beings. That's the most important thing. I think if you have that kind of human approach, then people will know these aren't just cookie cutter messages that are coming out. They don't know what we're dealing with. They don't know, what we're going through.
You mentioned cookie cutter messages, and one of the comments I saw this morning, because, like many people, I'm getting inundated with emails from companies that I didn't even remember doing business with, like, some duct cleaning company from like 15 years ago, or some aquarium you bought a fish from 12 years ago. And a lot of the messages do seem kind of cut and paste. And, to me, that doesn't seem to be adding a lot of value. Like one of the questions I got, I went on Twitter before we started our call, and I said, if you have any questions, send them in and we'll try to address them. And someone, I think his name was Kevin, said, is there such a thing as too much communication in a time like this? And to me, that's an example of that. Like, you don't necessarily need to be digging into client relationships you had 8, 9, 10, even 4 years ago. Do you think that a lot of organizations are just kind of knee-jerk sending out these emails because they see everybody else doing it and they think that they should be doing it as well?
Well, Kevin asks a brilliant question, first of all. That it's very noisy out there right now. And I think what you got to do is cut through the clutter and get to the facts. And so, it's kind of going back to basics and picking a couple of channels that are reliable and credible in your organization and focusing your time and effort there, prioritizing who your audiences are, making sure that, anyone who is in a position to communicate on behalf of your company is equipped with the messages that they need, but really taking it back to basics. Like this Zoom call, it was supposed to be a Zoom call today, is a great example of that. Like sometimes you just got to go back to paper and phone calls because, it's got to cut through the clutter, and you've got to be simple in times like these, simple and fast, because the facts are changing daily.
Right. By the way, this podcast is not brought to you by Zoom. I'm very irritated.
Thank you.
Irritated by no, that's fine. I'm glad you brought it up. I understand that their system is under tremendous strain, but I went in there, put my Visa card in there, set up a webinar. We had more than 70 people signed up for it, and then it just kind of disappeared from their server. Like I could still see it, but people are sending, there's error messages, and I spent 3 hours with their support people online yesterday. So, I think in real life, you have to have a backup plan. And so this was mine. Let's just record it, throw it online, and then hopefully the same people will end up seeing it. But this is not brought to you by Zoom. So just a little bit of humor there. I don't want to get sued by Zoom.
Right on.
So,
not brought to you.
So, you're in Eastern Canada, and, obviously watching the global situation, which companies stand out to you as doing it well or doing it not so well? Like, are there any standouts on either end of the spectrum for you?
Well, dare I say that I think that the government agencies are actually, I've been impressed with a lot of, I'll say I'm impressed with our province, and certainly I've been impressed at the federal level. Timely communication, decisive communication, and the posturing. I think the way that the communication is coming across is effective. Companies, I don't want to single them out.
How about good ones at least?
I've seen some really innovative thinking around restaurants and cafes and bars, like turning their businesses into drive-through situations. Some really entrepreneurial thinking that's coming out of this. And I think on the upside, companies that are supporting their employees to work from home, this is on the other side of this. We're going to see some really innovative new practices, which is exciting. Right now, it's just trying to focus day to day and trying to talk about stay and convey calm. A little story: back when I was working at the Children's Hospital, it was my first job in public relations and communications. And we had a young girl. This was public, by the way. CBC Fifth Estate did a feature story on this. We had a young girl who had experienced a medication error. And what happened out of that was that we knew that it was a matter of days that she would die. And the decision to communicate that publicly was debated because, of course, that it was a publicly, a lot of money went to the telethon and fundraising, et cetera. And so I was deeply concerned. I was really upset. We were all upset by this. And I clearly was showing it on my face because one of my teammates pulled me aside in the hallway and she said, Heather, she said, people are watching us right now. The communications team, we know what's going on, and they're watching us. They're watching our mannerisms. They're watching our expressions. And she said, even if you might not feel it, you got to look calm, and you got to keep calm and convey calm. And it was one of probably the best bits of advice I've ever received. So when you're shaking inside and you're nervous and scared or tired, just making sure that you know that people are watching you. And if you model that kind of behavior, others will follow.
That's a great story. It's a sad one. It reminds me that, I often say that, and what I think we're seeing right now, because obviously there's tremendous panic. There's, Twitter. Twitter is a nightmare right now. Scrolling through it, every story is terrible. The news media, the stock markets are, up and down, but mostly down, just bathed in red. And I have this line that I use, that the worst thing to happen in a crisis is the human brain. Like, we like to think that we're so modern and innovative and it's 2020 and we have these great devices and technology, but inside of us, we still have that primate or lizard part of our brain. When something like this takes place, one of the first things to go out the door is empathy. I've talked to a bunch of communications people about that in the past week, where they say, I know this as a rule, and I know that I should be doing this, but I have to remind myself at step 5, like, have empathy, express empathy, because you just get so focused on the task of how do we fix this? How do we get out of this? And we go into, I call it fight or flight mode, right? Like, you start mildly freaking out a little bit. And then if you allow that to spiral out of control, that is what I think leads to paralysis, bad decisions. Like, I'll call out some companies. I don't care. Norwegian Cruise Lines. I don't know did you see that story last week about what they were doing with their sales agents?
Mm-hmm.
So they were actively being instructed, the people who were answering the phones, because obviously cruise ships were being quarantined and stuff and getting some bad press. And so their salespeople were being told by email, and then someone leaked these emails knowing that this is not a cool thing to do. But they said, if you get someone asking about the coronavirus, just basically lie to them and tell them that it's fine, tell them it's not a big deal, because it was basically whatever you can do to get that sale, get those dollars in. And obviously this is, we're recording this on March 19th. This is about a week ago. So the situation has changed a lot. I don't know if they would do the same thing today, but to me, horrible business decision. And I say that 5 years from now, people like your audiences and your customers are going to judge your company not so much on the thing, right? Like, we have this pandemic, this virus situation that everybody's dealing with, but people have long memories, and we're going to remember the companies who showed leadership and the companies who acted like dicks. And I think that those companies on the long term are going to suffer. When I think of ones that are doing it really well, I think of Starbucks. Starbucks Canada, anyway, they basically said pretty early on, we're taking out all the chairs from our locations. We're going to be takeout only, sanitizing all our surfaces, and we're going to take care of our employees. We're going to make sure that everybody's paid and no one's going to get laid off. So to me, those are two companies on two different ends of the spectrum that I kind of think about when I watch this situation. But there's so many, doing it well and doing it not so well. And I just and just the response to this, to the call out for this webinar that we were supposed to have, which has turned into a podcast now, was tremendous. Like, people are really looking for answers. I want to jump in on something that you said a little earlier. You talked about, visible leadership and showing that leadership and communicating in tough times. What do you think about in terms of tactics? Like the sort of the block email is something that we all use as a sort of a base piece of communications. But this morning I saw a politician from the region that I live in do like a 2-minute YouTube video in council chambers, very calmly. Like, I think video is huge. What are your thoughts on that in terms of the actual tools, techniques, using social in times like this?
I couldn't agree with you more, actually, Warren. And I think that visible, there's a couple of ways I think about visible leadership. I remember working with a CEO and we were facing massive layoffs in the organization, which is going to happen in this case. And I remember he was staying in his office, and I was like, I would go into him and say, people, when they see you staying in your office, are making things up about what is going on in the organization, and they're assuming bad things, not good things. You need to get out of your office and move around the organization. Now, that's for an organization that, where you're physically able to do that. We have companies and businesses that have offices across Canada or the world, and that's not also always possible. So then, to your point, absolutely, YouTube video. I actually saw a municipal government just do a FaceTime event, held a FaceTime event, and did a announcement that way, and even just a phone call, like, back to basics, picking up the phone and calling someone, if you're able to do that, and pick, some of the organization's most credible champions, people who other employees go to, and use those as your, communicators, as your champions for messages, and have them position. They may not be formal communicators in your organization, but you can certainly use them as informal if they're respected and trusted already.
Good point. You up for a question? I'm getting questions from Twitter folks.
Absolutely.
Okay. And I think this is from someone in municipal in communications for a municipality in Ontario. How can we better effectively manage the need for speedy but accurate responses? We're feeling rushed and we're feeling overwhelmed with the volume of inquiries. Can we get ahead of the calls with the specific media approaches to lessen the overall workload? So it's basically, how do we handle this fire hose of requests that are coming in while they're feeling overwhelmed? Any advice or tips for that?
Oh, great. I think it comes down to clear roles and responsibilities for one, and you've got to tighten your approval processes too. So as much as developing messages is important, they're going to seem cookie cutter unless you have some way of taking the incoming feedback and building your messages around what you're hearing from outside, right? So it's a continuous loop. But I know a lot of organizations have heavy layers of approval that are required. And in this particular case, you've got to tighten those down. You've got to be close to the decision makers, and you've got to be moving quickly and listening, have some way to listen and bring that back into the organization and respond.
What's your advice for listening protocols? I often tell people that you're not going to know what's being said about you if you're not actually listening. Now, back in the day, we had media clipping services, and you'd get these packages every day, and many companies are doing that. What if you don't have access to that? What are some ways you would recommend for companies to kind of monitor and see what's being said about them or their organizations?
Great question. Well, I actually just worked with a company who, was big enough to have their own customer care division. And so we were constantly visiting and talking with the customer care folks to find out what the issues were that were coming in, and then picking the top 3 or 4, and then responding to those with messages from inside. So if the organization is lucky enough to have a customer care or customer service area, that's a really good place to go. Another really good place to tap, again, is look at your board of directors. If your board of directors, if you have one, is going to be out in the community and they're going to be hearing things, use that board of directors to kind of loop back. They're going to know your business, so they're going to probably know enough to filter through some of the clutter and bring back serious issues that you can pay attention to. Couple of tips there.
Thanks. So when should people be communicating? And I go back to the question about, is there such a thing as too much communication at a time like this? I think we all agree the answer is yes. How do you decide then when to communicate? And understanding that we're talking to people from a whole bunch of different companies and different organizations, how do you make that decision that we have something that we need to send out? How do you make that decision?
Yeah, great question. You and I both worked with a CEO who would use the term content-free messages. And I think we were lucky that we didn't hear it very often from that CEO. But I'm a big believer in saying something when you have something to say. I'm seeing a lot of messages or press conferences that basically don't really have anything new to say. And if you don't, you're going to lose your audience. They're not going to come back to you because they're waiting to hear concrete messages. So messages like, we've made a decision on how your work is going to be impacted from today forward. We've made a decision on how we're going to be supporting you through the changes that are coming. We've made a change in whether you will be working from home and how you get support to do that. Concrete decisions. But if you're just saying, we're waiting to hear more information, that's a waste of energy, and you'll have your employees stop coming to you for information if you're going to continue to do that.
So it seems like there is there are companies that are actually communicating real information, and then there are some that I think are just kind of faking it because they think that they should be communicating and they're just sending stuff out, like the appearance of effective communications, which I think just adds, if you have a press conference and you don't say anything, I think people are more kind of anxious or questioning after that. It's kind of weird.
So true. And I'll tell you, as I'm sitting here, my email is going off, and I've gotten 5 emails from businesses saying, really, we're just really concerned, but they're not actually saying anything.
You want to tell us who those businesses are?
You want me to? Seriously?
No, I'm just kidding.
No, but
we're all getting those. We're all getting those.
We're all getting them, but yeah. Okay. So just magnify that by how many messages our employees and our people are being bombarded with right now. And you can just imagine how hard it is going to be to cut through all of that and get them information that is actually factual and helpful to be able to do their jobs, to be able to care for their families, and be able to focus. Because right now, if you're worried about losing your job, I'm sorry, but you're not going to be focusing on doing the best for your company.
You sort of have to compartmentalize that to an extent, right? And you continue to do your job. We have another question. This is a really good one, and I'd be interested in, I'm going to ask this to John also, but here's one. There's an organization that is managing the situation through their Facebook page, and they're sending updates to their community, and they're answering questions, and they have open comments so people can make comments. And they said that the comments section seems to be getting very toxic very quickly. So there's a lot of trolls in there and second guessing decisions. And you guys aren't doing this or that. And they're really getting angry. And see earlier comment about fear and panic and everything else. So how do you manage the trolls and the negative comments while still trying to be a reliable source of information for your audience?
Oh, you got me on a raw point. And the reason it's raw for me is because I'm watching a small rural community right now do that on their some of their Facebook pages. And, it's the animals at the watering hole kind of, thinking. People are turning on each other, and it saddens me, but it also really frustrates me. So I poked my self in there and basically offered some factual information from our public health officials. I didn't wade in with taking a side. I didn't wade in with scolding. I just waded in with facts and encouraged people to pay attention to the facts. I think that's one way to do it. I'm not sure it's going to be useful to take sides and be seen to be kind of moderating. But I think if you go back to the facts and also point back to your values as an organization and say, look, in the spirit of our values, we appreciate communication that is respectful and sincere, and we don't appreciate the rest. So
I always feel like in those situations, patience and empathy, while you might want to delete the comment or respond with a little bit of snark, I think that on the long term, you're not really responding to the troll. You're responding to all the people looking at the post. And I've seen situations over time in smaller crisis situations where the troll mob jumps on and starts making all these angry comments and claims and accusations, and they want this pound of flesh, or they want someone to be fired or canceled. And then eventually, and sometimes over hours or the later in the day, the community kind of self-corrects. And then, like you said, people will come in with facts, or people will come in. In one case, I saw a situation where the local police came in and started commenting on the Facebook page and kind of providing information. So I think sometimes more rational heads will sort of prevail. What's your opinion on deleting posts like that? If someone comes in and they make a comment and it's negative towards the organization, but it doesn't have anything hate speech, racism, profanity, what's your position on do you delete it, or do you keep it there?
I keep it there. And I agree with you, Warren. I think that basically you come in with the facts. It's the same as if you were communicating inside your organization. You're going to stay focused on the facts, and you're going to communicate and understand with empathy that people are afraid, and fear and anxiety are going to impact the way people behave and the way they respond. And you mentioned earlier the kind of fight or flight response. So I think just understanding people are not behaving the way they might normally behave. Now's not the time to lay judgment on them, but just support them with the facts and continue to do that and keep that feedback loop going and bring back anything that is not factual.
I think your dog needs petting.
Oh, Lord. Sorry. Yeah.
Let him in.
Oh, there he is. Okay. We're isolating right now, so the dogs seem to be taking it seriously as well. Nice.
Empathy. This is a word that keeps coming up. And, when we do media training sessions, anything related to crisis, it's a huge, huge topic. A lot of people, though, think that you just check mark empathy by saying something like thoughts and prayers or our condolences go out to. You kind of have this one cut and paste line. Okay, I've expressed empathy. It's not really that easy. And I think people are sophisticated enough to know these days when a company is just mailing it in and just kind of cutting and pasting. So what would be some thoughts you have about how to express empathy, how to do it well, and how to actually mean it?
I think empathy is not kind of a strategy that you use. It's a way you are and who you are and how you are with people. I think with empathy, a big part of it is listening and acknowledging that you've heard someone. So when I talk about empathy with organizations, one of the things I understand is that listening and the way people respond to you and acknowledge whether they understand or not is different, can be different across culture. Some people just don't want to admit they don't understand what you've said. And some people don't want to seem to be dumb. And so they'll say they understand, but they really don't. And so listening and then qualifying what you've heard, repeating it back to them to make sure you understand clearly what their concerns actually are, and correcting any misperceptions or misunderstandings. I think that shows empathy. Just listening, but listening sincerely, listening and repeating it back to make sure you've clearly understood what their concerns are, not laying judgment. And then if you say you're going to follow up for them, follow up. Because it's just so disrespectful to say, yeah, no, I got it. I know what you're saying. I'm going to get you an answer, and then just nothing.
Right. We have another question if you want to take one.
Yep.
Okay. This is a tough one. What practices would you recommend when you have to discuss COVID-19 related deaths in your community? This is, again, someone from the municipal sector. What strategy would you use if you have to discuss deaths that are related to the disease? Anything specific that jumps out at you?
So I just had a client actually ask me for, this is when it gets real, right? A client asked me for a message for the first presumptive case and then a message for the first death, knowing that this particular kind of organization was, inevitably going to face this. It's healthcare. And so that made it real for me. And so writing those messages, I worked in a children's hospital. I've had to communicate these kinds of messages before, but every time it just brings it back to, this is people we're talking about here. And so I think that if for municipal governments who are reporting it, for hospitals, for whoever is in the situation that they have to do that, really making sure that you have the right spokesperson to speak to it is important to begin with. And as someone who can speak in a way that is compassionate and caring and doesn't just talk about numbers, but talks about people, and then talks about those people with respect. I think getting the spokesperson right is really important, and I think it's a really tough thing with my client. Of course, the message was going to come from the CEO, and it was going to acknowledge that the other employees that are, the people who are caring for these people have been impacted. Just really understanding who's impacted by the loss is really important.
You brought something up that was a lot of communicators might take for granted, but a lot of other leaders of organizations might. It's kind of subtle, but very interesting. You talked about coming up with messages that you don't need yet. And many organizations, I think, are in this kind of knee-jerk reaction state where something happens and then let's scurry and create some messages. Another thing happens and they kind of create messages. This is something that is like, textbook corporate or crisis communications, where you come up with hypothetical messages that you might need at this stage and this stage and this stage. And you may not end up using them, but at least you've kind of gotten ahead a little bit and saved some time. That's something that you just kind of mentioned it as if, of course, everybody does this, but I think you're seeing that everybody doesn't. Like, can you talk a little bit about how that process works, what the value of proactively creating messages or briefing statements or scenarios, practice interviews, that kind of stuff to save time?
Oh, yeah, no, you're right. I guess I shouldn't assume that everyone would go there, but I guess when we've done it enough with different crises, it's an automatic thing, just anticipating all of the things that could happen. And so you're hyper aware, right? And you're looking outward. Okay, what if this happened? What if this happened? What if this happened? You're building your FAQs and your kind of what if scenarios, right? And then, you're starting to anticipate. And this CEO is brilliant. They wanted me to kind of look ahead because they knew this is what's going to happen. And so what could happen with your employees? What could happen with your customers? What could happen with your patients and families? Anticipating all the scenarios, writing messages, brief messages for each of them, and then also looking at who needs to receive those messages.
So one of the, when we sent some emails back and forth before we chatted, and one of the points we talked about was that employees, again, a very often kind of forgotten about or ignored audience. So like we figure, they'll see the update, they'll figure it out, but they need to be kind of communicated with very often first, and in a slightly different way, because these are your ambassadors. These are the people who are kind of running your company. So right now, people who are working for these organizations, and we've alluded to it a couple of times, are concerned about losing their jobs, concerned about losing shifts, concerned about maybe having to be made to go to work and maybe getting sick. All these different things swirling through their minds. Is the company going to survive? Are we going to make it? Because we've already seen restaurants in the Toronto area that have actually shut down because of this. So one of the points you made I thought was brilliant, where you talked about it, figuring out as a leader, again, it goes to empathy. What does this mean for my employees? And then trying to align different functions within the company to support them, whether that's human resources or legal or finance. Can you talk a little bit about how to provide value and as much confidence as you can for your employees by doing that at an organizational level?
Yeah, my instincts have always been to work closely with, if your company has HR, finance, legal, and IT, because those are the areas that are going to be communicating policy changes, decisions, and actions to employees. And when I think one of the callers or people participating mentioned earlier that, how do you kind of get that speed, and how do you, because everything is happening so quickly, I think how you get your speed is start coordinating internally with everyone who's communicating with the employees. So think about the employee, how many messages they're getting from different departments in the run of the day. Strip that back, pull it back to one message that basically is anything they need to know from an occupational health and safety perspective, anything they need to know from an HR perspective about how their job is going to be impacted. Strip it back, and so that they're not being bombarded with 6 or 7 different emails from different departments inside the company every day.
Thank you very much for that. So before we wrap up, and I know you've got other things to do, obviously, and I value your time once again, I want to talk a little bit about leadership, because you have been you've worked CEO as well of an organization. You didn't pat yourself on the back and chat about that, but you've got leadership experience, and you've worked with a bunch of different leaders and seen some that were great and maybe some that were not so great. I have this philosophy when it comes to kind of business, but also crisis management, that doing the right thing operationally is always the right thing public relations wise. And I think of companies like, obviously, Maple Leaf Foods and the way they handled their crisis in 2008, which was, from a Canadian standpoint, like the best example of crisis management. And on the other end of the spectrum, I look at companies like Boeing, which I've been just jumping on their back for over a year now, because you had the situation, like it's just this cascading series of catastrophes where they had this operational defect and they tried to cover it up, and they had the 2 plane crashes, and it was like 10 months before they even acknowledged that something had gone wrong. And now you see, they fired the CEO right around Christmas. They tried to tuck that in before the holidays. Like that, even that was a weaselly move. Like I thought the timing of his dismissal, the amount of money that he was given to exit, I think like $60 million severance package on top of his $30 million salary. And now I saw a story last night that Boeing is in a very, very precarious state as a company, because all these decisions combined with this global crisis have really put the company in a very difficult situation. So long story, but to basically say doing the right thing is always the right thing operationally and communications wise. What would be, and we'll leave the sort of communications sector a little bit right now and talk more about leadership. If you're a mid-level or a frontline communicator and you have ideas about how your company should be communicating, but your leaders are not there. Maybe it's the leader who is stuck in their office and who is freaking out inside and doesn't know what to do, or they're kind of paralyzed by anxiety. What's your advice for that leader? Because the leader's philosophy and the leader's approach really dictates how the company is going to be perceived, and you can't communicate well unless your leader, manager, president, whatever, has given you the go-ahead. So if you could have a pipeline into the offices of all those CEOs and executive directors and chairs of boards who might be freaking out right now, what would be your one piece of leadership advice you'd want to give them?
Oh, wow. Okay, no pressure there. You're absolutely right. And we've worked worked for a company really that believed that in order to have satisfied customers, you must first have satisfied employees. And I think that company did a fantastic job when it came to treating employees with respect, and it paid off with high employee satisfaction results, and it paid off with high growing profits, growing profitability. So a lot of times leaders think about the bottom line first. If you have satisfied employees and employees are loyal to you, then you're going to have satisfied customers. It's going to show up that way. So whether you need to talk to leaders and talk to them about the business benefits or just remind them of the values, it's a tough one, Warren. I don't know how to, it's so vitally important. And I know that all of the examples you have described are ones that, I teach university students in communications, and we look for case studies. And the ones you're talking about are the case studies we talk about, and things that went well and things not to do. So those lessons live on if we can learn from them. I think that's the most important thing. But when I've sat in front of leaders and I have tried to kind of remind them of the values of the organization and the moral and right thing to do, it sometimes has, I've had to look at research other examples of how it didn't go well because they took this decision, and things they learned from it in another company or another hospital, and use that to convince them. And because some people go with facts and some people go by, their brain or their heart. But it's a really tough one. We as communicators are often the conscience of an organization, whether we're asked to be or not. And it can take a lot out of us as we try to continuously remind leaders to lead with their values and their conscience, right? It can take a lot out of it. We win some of them, we lose some of them. So.
And I really believe that over the long term, people will remember the companies that did this properly and the companies that didn't so much. And I think that there will be a financial price to pay and maybe a career price to pay for some of them. Just before we go, what are some tips for using social media tools at this time? What do you think would be, like, for you, what are some of the most valuable ones that people can use? The ability to have these tools for free on your phone or on your computer, I think a lot of people take for granted and aren't using them. Like, everyone's going to the email and the big newsletters. What do you think would be some ways that people could use social effectively to transmit information in these interesting times?
Well, I've been with some of my clients that I've been doing just simple, Facebook posts to share some positive news, to make sure that people know that, some good things are happening in the world, or that some good things are happening in terms of, the company, and without being. This is not the time to sell, by the way. Like, this is not a time to sell. I've seen some ads come out from companies like a gym, trying to get you to join the gym. And then the next thing they're communicating that they're closed. So clearly, some people have to look at their messaging and make sure that they're pulling back on some of the stuff that's automated. But, I'm liking just some of the basics. I'm still on Twitter, as much as it's, hard on the head. I'm, using Zoom with some of my clients because we're not able to do face-to-face. Skype, clearly. I'm on LinkedIn, loving being there, really using LinkedIn to communicate just with the community, but also let people know we've had some conferences canceled and things like that. So, trying to reach out to professionals in that capacity. So just some of the tried and true. And like I say, just going back to basics.
That's such a great point about not selling. I've seen a couple examples of companies using this as a blatant opportunity to market. And then there are other companies that have online ad campaigns that they don't realize that they still have running, that you might want to check that. It might be some kind of tone deaf stuff. I saw someone yesterday say this is the time to advertise online because everybody's sitting there at home and they're just waiting. And I'm like, yeah, they're not looking to buy your gym membership or your, musical figurines or your ice cream sandwiches. People are kind of in freak out mode right now. So I really believe that this is like, I'm doing zero selling right now, but I'm trying to keep myself busy. I'm out, trying to walk 20,000 steps a day, trying to, have hang out with my kids, doing this podcast, which hopefully will provide some value to people. And I joked here earlier that I sold a hockey card on eBay last night. So like things are really looking up.
Things are really looking up.
What are you doing?
I think, you know what? You raise a really good point, Warren, about taking care of yourself. And I think that, you know what? I've sat in hotel rooms till 3:00 in the morning during union negotiations. And, I was the media relations person. And you know what? You go on steam after a while and you're just exhausted, but you want to do the right thing by your company and you want to show them that you're up to the challenge. Well, you know what? When things like this this is not, to be cliche, this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. Make sure you're taking care of yourself and, support one another if you're lucky enough to have teammates and, just like take care of yourself in all of this because the work you're doing is behind the scenes in a lot of cases and there's not a lot of like people applauding what you're doing, right?
That's right.
So other than us, right, Warren, we're applauding you all.
What's your, there are a lot of tired, frustrated, angry, scared communicators out there who are, well, and really, because I'm seeing their comments online. They're putting on a brave face and they're doing their jobs. What's your one kind of positive piece of advice you would give to them as someone who's been, a veteran in this industry where people, they might not be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. They might not be able to see that this too shall pass. What would be your one sort of piece of wisdom that you'd want to share with them?
Well, a good friend of mine says, and I don't know if it applies, but he says, never waste a good crisis. So, you know what, I always see that there is something that is going to come out of this in the long run. There's going to be something positive, whether you and your team are going to, come closer together as a result of this. We've worked in situations where the way we managed a merger or an acquisition at the end of the day earned so much credibility for the teams. And it meant that we were called upon afterward more than we were before. And so, you can really rise to the occasion in all of this and use this as an opportunity to position communications in your organization as a strategic and valued business. And so this could make your job a lot easier down the road. It probably will. So hang in there and, talk to other people like us or, people online or your peers and just know that it will get better.
How can people follow you on Twitter? What's your handle?
At Spidell.
There you go. Thanks for doing this so much. All the best to you and your family, and we'll have to keep in touch. But thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Warren. All the best.
John Perenack, thanks so much for being here in the middle of this pandemic quarantine situation.
Oh, happy to be here, Warren. Coming to you from quarantine day 5, I think.
We're only a few blocks away from each other, but I figured, why chance it? We'll Skype it, and then we'll hang out for beers when this is all over.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so why don't you just take a second to quickly introduce yourself, tell folks, the kind of 60-second, who are you, where do you work, and maybe even a little bit of backstory of how we know each other.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I'm a principal at StrategyCorp, and we're a strategic communications firm in Toronto. Our expertise is really managing big challenges or trying to take advantage of big opportunities. All of us have background in either politics or working in communications for large companies. And I've been doing this for over 20 odd years now. You and I think, Warren, have known each other for almost as long, if not a bit longer. there, and I can recall that it's many of these crisis communications examples over the years that you and I have shared our best practices over beers on.
So put this into context. We've communicated through September 11th, and we've communicated through the global financial crisis and the big power outage in Toronto. Where does this register on the Richter scale for you?
You know what? I really think this is actually on par with September 11th, if not an order larger. And I think it's because it is an unprecedented kind of situation. In many circumstances, all those things were natural disasters or, incidents that happen quickly and they're over pretty fast. Now, mind you, the rebuilding process always takes a long time after a crisis. But what we're in the middle of is a slow-moving natural disaster. This thing is still happening. And, as a communicator, you have to react in the moment. But it's still going on, and so you can't actually pivot to that proactive sort of phase when you try and rebuild the reputation or try and move people on to the next thing, because we're in a situation where we're probably going to be dealing with this as an active event for weeks, if not a couple more months to come.
Wow. One of the things that has occurred to me, and I often talk about human psychology as being problematic in crisis situations. And so here you have, first of all, a crisis that isn't just hitting one company or three companies. It's like every company and every country. And then you have all these people now who are being asked to stay home and have spare time on their hands. So you have a crisis situation, plus you have people sitting at home, staring at the wall or looking at their cat. And the mind starts to play tricks on you, and you start to get into that kind of panic feedback loop. So I appreciate your time here today and your expertise, and have been getting a ton of responses from people who are communicators who are being asked to do Herculean tasks these days in terms of creating content, creating messages, dealing with audiences, external, internal media, social media, while all of this is unfolding. And they're also trying to take care of their families and make sure that they are healthy and get groceries. And how do you manage this situation? Like, how do you work from home with kids running around? I think both of us have a little bit of experience in that area over the years that we could lend to people, but,
For sure.
But this is certainly not easy. So I have two questions that I got from people online just since my last interview, and I want to throw those at you, just see how you do kind of on the fly.
Sure.
One of them is, if they're taking any questions, I'd appreciate some insights into how can health-related nonprofits start to reposition themselves and their asks of government. What should nonprofits consider, especially if they advocate on health conditions not related to the pandemic?
So, the trick with advocating with government, and this is where sort of communications and government relations intersect, and that's one of the things that StrategyCorp does really well, is managing both those things. But it's the key is to trying to find a way that the thing you want to talk about or is important to your organization, find the point of alignment with what the government's trying to do. And oftentimes what we find, though, in this situation is you can find that point of alignment, but the timing isn't right. And I think that's maybe the situation right now for a lot of organizations, is that, the government is in literally all hands on deck trying to manage not only the public health crisis, but the economic crisis that's come with this. And so as you look for those points of, how can we talk about the thing we're doing as being helpful to the government in achieving their policy objectives, we have to also think about when is the right timing to bring that forward, because the bandwidth of these people who are in the public service is extremely limited right now, and your ability to get their attention is going to be extremely limited. So you really have to think about both those things, and oftentimes it means you can't do it all when you want. Frankly, right now, we're going to have to let some time pass and let some normalcy return, so that we're at least in a steady state of crisis management versus the complete sort of all hands on deck crisis management that's happening now.
What stage would you say we're in right now? You talked about the slow moving natural disaster, and I think people want to be doing something. We want to be creating solutions and kind of working our way out of this, but this is something that's kind of out of everyone's control. Yeah.
And the thing is that the different parts of the community are still reacting differently to this event. There are some people who have fully adopted. They've gone to quarantine, or they've gone to self-isolation, and only going out when they had to. But there's still others who are acting like, oh, this is inconvenience, and I wish this would be over. I think we're still in the initial stages of acceptance and trying to get people to understand what we're actually dealing with. And you know what? Probably in 2 weeks or so, we'll have a better sense of what the path ahead looks like. But I would say, if this was a 5-step process, we're probably on step 2 right now, because we're still pretty early in the game.
You've probably been getting all those emails from every service provider you've done business with over the last 20 years. Do you think that some organizations are over communicating right now?
I really do. I think, in fact, the question was posed at some point, who do you think is doing a great job communicating in this crisis, and who's not? My first reaction was, I think there's a lot of organizations that see others communicating and feel like we have to do something too. And so as a result, what's happening is people are being flooded with communications that aren't terribly relevant to them. And as a result, what that means is that people aren't internalizing really much of anything. And so if you're an organization, you really have to think about, based on our communications objectives, which always have to be tied to our organization's business objectives or the things we're trying to achieve as an organization, does it make sense to do this communication? Is it going to be helpful to our audiences? Is it going to help them understand what we're trying to do? Is it going to help them understand what they maybe need to know because of their relationship with us? And because I think there's a lot of just knee-jerk, we got to communicate, and there's a lot of the same stuff going out. It's flooding people's inboxes. It's flooding the airwaves. It's flooding, their space online. And I think it's making it harder for people to really internalize anything that's being said.
And it's not adding value. It's almost like just amping up it's kind of hitting that raw nerve, right? Like just reminding you that it's going on, but not actually giving you any solutions.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right.
What's your company doing? Have you sent out blanket emails to clients? Or are you on the phone? Or are you just kind of doing one-on-one?
So that's a great question. So in fact, we saw a lot of people in the space sending out broadcast emails. We chose to be a bit more tailored. What we did was we created a communication that was aimed both first off internally to really equip our people who are now all working from home. How can you get things done, and what are the best ways of going about working from home, to make sure they were ready to keep delivering for our clients. For clients, we thought rather than a broadcast message, which is going to get lost in the clutter of things, we developed a customized communication that our engagement managers are providing directly to clients on a one-off basis, so that the clients it's tailored to the client, it's specific to their needs, and really demonstrates our ability to continue supporting them in this new environment. Because what we've had to do is, obviously, many of the things we do, like public engagement, or sort of workshops that would have been done face to face, we're switching to doing them via digital means, so that things can keep getting done, just in a way that's compliant with the public health environment we're in.
You using Zoom at all? I'm kind of angry at those guys this week.
So we've used it occasionally. We use Microsoft Teams for the most part.
Right.
And so far, so good.
Yeah. So, and once again, apologies to everyone who signed up for this via Zoom. We had some technical issues yesterday, and I figured rather than risk it again, we're just going to do it, the old-fashioned way, throw a podcast out there and see what we can do. So I have another question from a communicator named Shauna, and she's saying, what tools do communicators need right now? There's so much information that I'm recommending to her clients that they offer a consolidation of applicable information to their employees so they can find everything they need in one kind of hub or place. So this is about kind of arming your employees with the information they need so that they can discuss what they need to with your external stakeholders. What are some tools that you think can make that more seamless so that you're not losing information or people aren't getting late information? What do you think are some solutions that people could use?
Mm-hmm. So one of the ones that we've become to rely on a lot is Microsoft SharePoint. So for our organization internally, it provides a basis for providing a common set of information to people, so they can get it in an uninterrupted way whenever they need it. Since it's cloud-based, it's easy for staff to access it. Microsoft Teams is also a good tool that we use for the same purpose, because it allows great collaboration between our people and providing information to them, allowing them access to documents and things. Again, it's all from the cloud, so they can access it anywhere from any device. These are all sort of part of the basic Office 365
offering,
cloud subscription, and so it's easy for people to use. I would say though the key thing though is thinking about, like, the tool is just the delivery mechanism. The key thing is to think about what information is important for people to have, and really thinking through that from the stakeholder standpoint. What do they need to know? And then working backwards from there. Because once you understand who the stakeholder is and how they get information, you can think about the best conduits to get that information to them. And then, of course, you have to think about what is the right information to get to them, because we don't want to, as we just discussed, flood them with things that they've already heard, they're hearing other places that aren't really relevant to them, and it really doesn't add value. Because, once you start flooding an audience with information that is really isn't valuable, they start tuning you out. And the environment we're in, with so many different people having so many different sort of channels around them they can listen to, and conduits they can get information from, you really have to be careful. So it's not about quantity, it's about quality.
Okay. So I do a lot of sort of conference or keynote talks, and one of the 2 or 3 topics that I speak about is crisis management, crisis communication. So I've been out there like Chicken Little over the last couple of years, and telling people that they needed to get prepared for these sorts of things. And not to say, like, kind of I told you so. I think this is a pretty, people know that they should have this, but I have this line that I use at the beginning of a talk, and it kind of gets a little chuckle, but it's not funny, where I'll say, I'll ask how many people in this room. There might be 80 people, 100 people, 300 people. I'll say, how many people in this room, raise your hand if your company has a crisis management plan and it's up to date and you know where it is. And I swear to God, over the past year, I've never seen more than 15% of the hands in the room go up. And some of these are really crisis prone sectors and industries. And so I've said, and everyone has kind of a laugh, and I said, that's not high enough. We need to get that number higher. And so that, to me, the absence of a plan. So obviously we're in the middle of this thing. Step 2, as you mentioned, we're here in Canada. For a company that doesn't have a crisis management plan, a crisis communications plan, what can they do? Like, what can they do now? Because obviously there are going to be other steps, other shoes to drop. They're going to need to communicate. What are some things that they can do that would be cost effective? Like, if you were talking to a friend who owned a business who was really concerned about the shit hitting the fan, and they need to communicate with their audiences, they don't know where to start, what would your advice be to them?
So I think this goes back to taking a holistic look at your business. And a lot of organizations have business continuity plans in place, so that if that supply chain gets interrupted, we've got another one we can go to. The way that I like to describe crisis communications is about risk management. You're in the risk management business, right? You are helping your organization reduce risk so that you can continue business and continue to offer service in a continuous basis, no matter what happens. So those organizations that may not have a plan in place, like, even though you're in the midst of this situation now, this crisis now, you can still start now. So I would suggest starting by looking at who in your organization is in charge of business continuity and talking to them to understand what that plan looks like, or what those measures look like. Because what you want to do, in my opinion, is tie your communications tightly into the team that is leading that business continuity effort. Because there's really 2 halves to crisis communications. There's what you do and how you describe it. The what you do is really important, because if you're not doing things to fix the situation, or doing things to make sure you're continuing to deliver service, you don't got a lot to talk about. So you got to have substance there. And tying into that business continuity group is key to making sure that you've got substance that you can either suggest or put in place or talk about if it's already being done. So start by doing that. then making sure you've got a crisis communications team that has people from different parts, legal, the executive team, operations. Make sure they're all around the table, so you can make sure that in the midst of this crisis, you have the right decision makers there. And then start working on, obviously there's some things you can be talking about now that you may be doing already. But as you're doing this is a great opportunity to look at, okay, so where are the gaps in what we're doing? Because those gaps will be really important, because if you can make note of those now, as soon as you have some breathing room, those will be important to address as you develop a crisis communications plan. So that's the sort of first three steps I would suggest. But really, this is probably the worst case example you can think about when it comes to, how our lives and economy can be interrupted. And, hey, we may not have another one like this in the next, 10 or 20 years. But what if there was something, for your organization alone that was disruptive?
Right.
Now is a great learning opportunity to get ready for that.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you do all those things if you might be freaking out at the time? And we go back to human psychology, fight or flight. So these things, most people I think are quite rational when things are going well. And if you said to them, how would you communicate and what would you do and what are the steps? I think everyone kind of intuitively knows that. But when you throw the world into a tailspin like this, and the media and social media and your kids and their teachers and every company, and you're just getting all these messages from all over the place, and you're seeing the body counts stacking up, how do you keep it together to communicate effectively with your audiences when everything inside you is telling you to just run down the street or jump out the window or hide under your bed?
You got to keep it simple. Warren, you once said this, and it's always stuck in my head. You've got to elevate a message to a level of simplicity for people to understand it. By the same token, in these kinds of situations, you have to keep it what you're trying to do simple. If you try and do too much at this point, inevitably it's going to break down and nothing will be achieved. And that old adage, the perfect is the enemy of the good. Think about what things do we absolutely have to do now. What communications absolutely have to happen, and what are the ways we can be sure that we can get these communications out to our stakeholders with minimum interruption or minimum chance of some sort of breakdown. And start there, and I guarantee if you get those small successes under your belt, it's going to build momentum. It's going to be easier to do more. So that's, in my view, that's the key right now.
I stole that line from Lambie, by the way. He said that many years ago, and I took that from him and kind of passed it off as my own. What about there's legal risk and reputational risk, and those are often we always in communications we always have that. The sort of anecdote about the lawyers and the communicators fighting it out in the boardroom when there's a crisis, because the communicators want to err on the side of too much information and the lawyers want to say nothing at all because they don't want to be liable or get sued. This is a great example of one of those situations where you have these two opposite forces kind of pushing at one another. How do you suggest people balance that when it comes to their communications?
So this is why it's important to have a crisis communications group that includes your leadership team and all those key stakeholders around the table: legal, operations, communications. So I think of it this way: you're managing your reputational risk is one important job in a crisis. Managing your legal risk is another important job, and oftentimes we feel like those things are on opposite ends of the same rope. And as you point out, there's a bit of a tug of war that's happening between the two. And I think in this day and age, one of the nice things is that executive teams are becoming more and more attuned to the fact that if you want to be a successful organization, you have to manage both those things, both your legal risk and your reputational risk. And if you let the legal take precedence over everything else, your reputational risk could suffer. And by the same token, you don't want to just deal with the reputational risk to the detriment of the legal side of things. So by having this discussion in the context of a crisis communications team that has these stakeholders around the table, you've got a better chance of finding that medium in between where, as a communicator, you're not going to get everything you want. As a lawyer, you're not going to get everything you want, but you'll find a good place in the middle where both are addressed. in a way that protects the organization, and you get a better outcome at the end of the day.
One of the problems I've noticed is that in a lot of companies, communications isn't even at the executive table. They get called in when we need a brochure or we need a landing page or we need a Facebook post. But, and I think that's a leadership, I think that's a vulnerability or a sort of an Achilles heel of organizations where a lot of them they don't respect the communications function as being integral to managing all those pieces. And I think this is, if anything, is going to expose what a weakness that is.
Oh, I completely agree. In fact, I can remember examples where being in a situation where the client had a crisis, and you're working with the comms team, and they had zero line of sight into what was happening on the crisis management side, which sounds crazy because obviously the communications is an important part of that. But you nailed it, right? What happens is in those organizations is they are because it's like trying to drive a car with three wheels. They feel like they're managing it, but they're really not, because they're leaving a giant line of sparks behind them as the car's axle is dragging on the road. And so it's really important in those organizations, I think, to have from the leadership team an appreciation for communications and the value it can bring for reputation management. When you think about reputation now, how many organizations have suffered so greatly because of reputational issues? Like I think of a company like Boeing, right? They had an operational failure, but the reputational wreckage that has resulted from it is imperiling the whole company. And you see this over and over again, where that dynamic occurs, and it may seem to some a prudent idea to let communications take a back seat in the moment, but you pay the price sometimes in these kinds of situations.
I'm so glad you brought up Boeing, because they've been my poster child for the awful handling of crisis management. Their stock is down 40% in the last 5 days. And I would say that the mishandling of the sort of 737 MAX 8 situation and the just elongated train wreck of that, combined with the share buyback, combined with the pandemic, people are saying the company might be going under. They'll probably get some government bailout, but like this is how bad decisions and reputational damage accumulate. And I think it's a perfect example of that.
I think you're exactly right. And the thing is that once you get to the point where the reputational damage or the reputational harm is metastasized to the point it has, there is no easy road back, right? There is, like, if the 737 MAX were approved tomorrow, how many people are going to be jumping on board and want to fly that plane? There's a long road to recovery for in this case, for the product, but also for the company itself, because what's been laid bare is that it wasn't just a problem with the plane; it was a problem with the culture of the company, right. And that is a lot harder to fix. Like that's not a weekend do-it-yourselfer.
And all the way along, I think it was the second plane crash. I think was I don't have the dates right on the top of my head. I think it was March 10th of last year, so just over a year ago. And the company's former CEO, who got canned right around Christmas time, I think it was October 30th or something, where he came out and sort of said that, we may have made some mistakes. And like, that's a very long delay. That should be like same day, 48 hours. So, I want to revisit something you mentioned a little bit earlier, because I personally find it fascinating. And when you think about it, this stuff is it's not rocket science. It seems fairly basic until you kind of start applying it, and then it becomes there are nuances in it. It is kind of difficult, but like, and take Boeing as an example. Doing the right thing operationally to me is always the right thing to do. And so here's an example of a company that didn't. And I always think of these two sort of parallel flow charts, right? One is, okay, you're dealing with a crisis or a situation. What did we do? Like, how did we respond operationally? And then the second one is the communications flow chart. And the communications flow chart is determined completely by what you do. Like, if you do the wrong thing, there was that old expression, putting lipstick on a peg. Like, there's no way you can, and that's when you get companies being deceitful, being spin doctors and trying to like weasel, and that's where the worst side of public relations gets a bad name when you're trying to avoid the elephant in the room and not really deal with difficult issues. So there are a lot of companies out there who, and I've worked with some of these folks in training sessions where, we'll be doing a simulated crisis over the course of a day, and I would be the guy playing the role of the like CBC journalist, right? So they have a crisis. The senior management team is told what the crisis situation is in the morning, and then there's different escalation points, like something else happened and someone got injured, and then the police did this, and that's happening on social media, and then I would call in I'd be like downstairs in the lobby or whatever. I'd call in to the reception desk, pretend to be a journalist, and they kind of knew that this was going to happen, but I call in, pretend to be a journalist, and I ask to speak to the CEO. And so the executive assistant would write that down on a piece of paper and bring it into the boardroom where everybody's kind of working through this issue. And then they would put that down on the table. And so I'm waiting for the call, and they've been through media training, like they should know what to do. So I'm sitting there waiting, and having a coffee, waiting with my camera and my tripod, and they didn't get back to me for 45 minutes. And it was so funny when we were doing the post-mortem later in the day, and I said there was a huge delay between when I called and when someone got back to me with anything. And they said, it was funny because to them, it felt like only 5 minutes. Because you're dealing with a crisis, and the perception of the passage of time changes, and they thought that it was enough that they were doing all the important things and making the right decisions. And I have to say they handled it extremely well in the boardroom, saying, we're going to do this and we're going to do this, and they were communicating with certain people, but they didn't have anyone say, okay, get back to that journalist, call them up and schedule an interview or provide them with a statement. Because I said in real life, what ends up happening is if I don't hear from you in 45 minutes, I'm knocking on your door. I'm going to be at your office, and that's now we've escalated it, and I'm a little bit, I'm thinking the company has something to hide, or maybe I'm going out to an analyst or shareholder or someone else in the audience who now you've lost an opportunity to tell your story. So even though you're making all the right decisions in the boardroom or in the war room, if you're not communicating it at the same time, it's almost like you're not making the right decisions.
I agree completely. Like, oftentimes I see clients or situations where when that journalist phone call comes in, it's like Revenue Canada call. It's like, oh, good God, what are they? I don't want to talk to them. But they forget that, okay, yeah, that may not be a great interview you're going to have. It's not going to be about talking about all the great things your organization is doing, but it is a key conduit for you to get through to your audiences. And not only that, to your point about speed, like I want to get back to that journalist as quickly as possible so that before they talk to the next third party person who's going to comment on my situation, I've been able to influence their thinking. I've been able to seed some stuff in their head so that, maybe some of the misconception they have, or maybe so the information they have that is wrong can be corrected, and we're not coming in at the last minute when their story is already pretty much fully baked and we're just adding in a quote at the end. So I totally agree the speed is really key in those situations.
So empathy is something that keeps popping up. Chatted with Heather about that, and it's everyone knows, again, when things are going well and everything's calm, everyone knows you should be a nice person. You should be empathetic to your audiences. But for some reason, when a crisis takes place, we get this psychological response where people have the equivalent of these blinders on, and they, their heart is beating and they're sweating and they're kind of freaking out, and they're focused on fixing the issue. And sadly, and it's funny because I've talked to communicators about this through a Twitter direct message and email, and they said, like, even though I've been in this business like 20 years and I know I should be empathetic, like, it's at the very end, I'm like, oh my God, yeah, I should ask how people are doing and say, and just listen to them. What I've seen in a lot of these emails and a lot of these even videos of executives online talking to their audiences is it sounds like cut and paste empathy. And so, talk a little bit about, why it's important, which I think most people understand, but I think it bears repeating. And then how do you actually cultivate genuine empathy in the middle of a crisis when you might be freaking out?
So I think it's a great question. It strikes me that we see this a lot in communications when there's a crisis or an issue. The first line of the release or the first line of the statement is, our top priority is the safety of so-and-so, or whatever the case may be. And it just seems so like throwaway and rote that, to your point, doesn't really carry the meaning that it really should have. And so I think it's really important that you think about the audience you're trying to talk to. What do they really need? Like, think about them as human beings. Like, think about them as, what is the situation they're in, right? Like, if I'm communicating today to somebody in the service industry in Toronto, right, I want to put myself in their shoes. Like, these are probably people who are earning, an hourly wage, probably really dependent on that time at the hotel they work at. So, what is their situation? Like, talk to them in a way that connects with them. And I think sometimes as communicators we forget that there's actually people at the other end of the stuff that we're sending out, and we should try and really think about who we're trying to reach. That's why you really need to segment your communications. Like, a one size fits all doesn't really work anymore, especially now you've got so many different sort of channels that people are communicating through and so many different ways to reach people. You got to make sure your communications is tailored for those channels, but also the people at the other end of those things.
I just saw an update on LinkedIn. Global recession may have begun. I'm like, no shit, Sherlock. So, the points you bring up are great about, people are human beings. What a novel concept to think of them as humans. And I'm also thinking about that server or that sort of frontline service industry worker who is, I think, the biggest problem or biggest concern on their mind is like, how am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to buy groceries? That's not really a communications issue, but like, that's the question. I did a webinar yesterday for another industry just as a favor to them, because their people are losing contracts, they're losing events, they're losing money. They don't know when it's going to fix itself. In the event space, one of the big concerns is that even once, like, let's say 3, 4, 5 months from now, when things get back to normal, there's going to be competition for those conference rooms and those spaces, and the biggest companies are going to be able to squeeze out the smaller players. So, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but like, what's your advice to people who are in, the biggest issue for them is financial in nature? Like, how am I going to pay the bills? Again, it's hard to be a great communicator when you don't know how you're going to make your mortgage payment. Like, we saw, the Canadian government came out with an announcement of $82 billion in funding that they're going to be dispersing throughout the country. Do you think we're going to see more of that? And is that going to be enough? Or do people need to start doing other things to supplement their incomes? Like, what would your advice be to people who are sweating the financial realities of this?
So I think this is interesting time because, we're in previous crises, and I look back to 2008 and the sort of financial meltdown that happened then. A lot of the relief that was delivered was aimed at corporations, and I think the big difference this time is that governments of all stripe have realized that actually the way to fix this is to get checks in people's hands and get them money that they're going to spend. Because the big difference is that in 2008, the economy was actually fundamentally had issues, right? Like, the whole banking system was broken, and there needed to be some structural change that happened here. What we've got here is like an unprecedented economy-wide essentially shutdown. But the fundamentals of the economy, like going into now, people may have said, the stock market is a bit overvalued and whatnot, but the fundamentals of the economy are working okay. And what's happened here isn't, like with COVID-19, isn't the economy breaking because something fundamentally was wrong with it. It's breaking because no one can work. Like, people are got to stay home, and it's difficult for them to work, and businesses have to shut down. So the good news is that if government does do what it looks like it's doing and going to get money into people's hands, and once, if we do this properly and we can sort of limit the exposure of this virus to people and limit the amount of people who get sick with it, the economy actually could probably restart with this boost pretty well. So the idea is that, people who are in this risky moment where they can't work, hopefully the government funding will help them, and they'll be in a position to, when things restart in a few months, to slowly get back into where they were. I think that actually with this for companies, what this is important is that it's really an opportunity for you to show how you as an organization how you treat your people, which goes to your reputation directly, because those people are your frontline ambassadors of the organization, and this is the test right now. How do you treat those people? What are you doing for them? How are you helping to make their existence meet ends between now and when things can get back to normal? Because there isn't going to be another test like this anytime soon. I think your reputation can be defined by this this moment.
I agree, and people have long memories. They will observe.
Yeah.
Like, I mentioned in the previous interview the Norwegian cruise lines. Did you see the leaked emails from last week?
Yeah, I did.
That's like awful.
Yeah.
And so when I think, and it goes back to,
it just shows the lack of concern.
And it goes back to doing the right thing is always the right thing. You know, if you put dollars over safety, dollars over employees, that's going to get exposed. Today we're in a whistleblower, Yelp, a travel advisor, what's a TripAdvisor, whatever it is, Google review culture, and companies that act like dicks are going to be punished, and rightfully so. So just to go back to the markets, you know, the response on the markets has been devastating. Do you think that is not in some way a different variation of the same phenomenon we've seen with people hoarding toilet paper and hand sanitizer? You know, that one guy with like 17,000 bottles in his garage. Isn't it the same thing? That's that primitive part of our brain that's making people sell.
Yeah, I think this is fight or flight, right? And you want to either hoard stuff that's going to keep you whole, or in the case of the market, you want cash, because you don't know what the heck the world is going to have in a few months, and you don't know what the situation is going to be like. And I think it's because there's a lack of leadership in many cases, right? Like especially in Canada, like there's been, like, we've acted quicker than others, but there's been not this level of coordination you might expect immediately. I think now it's improving, right? You see other governments and other public health agencies across Canada starting to come into alignment with what their recommendations were. But initially, there was like different ideas about what should be done depending on where you went. And I think, you know, for Canada, we're also at the mercy of the fact that there's like very little leadership in the U.S. And as a result, when you think about what the future holds, there's, okay, how is Canada going to do? But there's then, you know, what's going to be happening in the U.S. A month from now, because I'm not at all convinced they have this under control there, and that could be a great influence on what happens in our country. And as communicators, that's something we're going to have to deal with. Like, it's going to be the environment around us, and we can't escape it.
So, non-communications question, but do you see this as a buying opportunity, or do you think it will become one?
Well, if I was any good at investing, I'd have an answer for that. So,
come on, you're very modest. You're very astute observer of the financial markets. You're trying to sidestep that very graciously.
Honestly, if I knew the answer, I would say, honestly, I'm unsure. I keep watching the markets, thinking, you know, oh, this sounds like a good buy opportunity. But, you know, with the markets,
down 20%.
You never want to be in that position where you're rushing to catch the falling knife.
Yeah, that's the perfect analogy for that. And
you know, when you look at what's happening, there's just so much uncertainty that I don't think anyone who's saying they know what the answer right now is accurate.
So we both like Elon Musk, great guy, smart guy. Yeah. Obviously, he's like disrupting industries routinely. Has come out in the last couple of weeks with a series of tweets basically saying that he thinks that the situation, while serious, is overblown, and that the real risk is more the panic than the virus itself. What are your thoughts?
Well, the two are kind of the same, aren't they? Right? Like, I don't think you have the virus without the
panic without the virus.
The panic, yeah. And I think the reality is, though, when someone says the panic, like, we're in uncharted waters in modern times anyway. And when public health agencies say, you know what, this is the time to overreact, and then let's have a debate about it later. I'm inclined to say, yeah, you know what, that's okay, guys. I'm going to follow your advice. And if that means that we're doing more than maybe we should have in terms of social distancing and shutting things down, well, whatever. That's an academic debate that people can have later. I think though that what it does show, and I think this relates to the panic part of things, is that frankly, people, when you look at the way economies, whether it's North America or even Western Europe, there isn't a lot of time that's spent with planning for a crisis or planning for an emergency. This, I guess, touches back on what you said off the top, Warren, about, companies not really being prepared for crises. People often aren't prepared for crises. Like how many people have, like even Canada, I think for ages has said you should have 72 hours of stuff in your house in case there was a blackout or something to hold yourself over. How many people actually do that, right? And I think because of that, when an event like this happens, the panic ensues. Oh my God, and they see something on TV and then they rush out and start mimicking that behavior. Right. So if anything, if there's an upside, maybe this is an opportunity as we move out of this, where more organizations and more people say, you know what, it's not about being a fearmonger. It's about just making sure that we're prepared. Should one of these events happen, and let's think ahead and plan through some of the scenarios that are most probable to happen.
Those preppers are really pleased with themselves these days, I'm sure.
Yeah,
basement's full of those freeze-dried foods. Let me see here. Where do we want to go before we wrap up? I want to put you in a difficult spot. I want you to grade some of the political leaders in terms of their communications. How have they done? Just any names, Donald Trump, whatever. You saw his clip that I sent you last night about China.
I know it's just such a
So has anybody stood out to you as actually stepping up and surprising you?
Well, I think in Canada, really all the whether it's Doug Ford or whether it's Justin Trudeau, it's everyone acted quickly. They may not have all been in concert at the beginning, but they took action and took the situation seriously because they were listening to their experts, right? That's the key thing in a crisis. That's why you want to have that crisis team, because you've got a broad variety of people around the table who have each with different expertise areas about the business, or about, in this case, the province or the country, and can help you make better decisions and minimize risk. So in those cases, I think they acted quickly. I think they did the right things. They were pretty effective communicators, and to the point now where you really don't see much partisanship at all, if any, in Canada. Everyone's sort of unifying under one cause, which is almost like a war mobilization effort against this virus.
It reminds me of September 11th, when a lot of that partisan stuff kind of went away, and obviously it came back. You talked about maybe a new appreciation for crisis management, crisis preparedness, and I would say, related to that, just because of my role, media training. You would think that, the 85% of companies who have never thought about this coming out of this would say, maybe there's some value in that. Maybe we should look at this for our organizations. I really think that it's just going to go back to business as usual. I really, that's the pessimistic side of me, but human nature is, once this is over, or once there's a vaccine, or once it's kind of run its course and 80% of everybody has it and is now immune to it, I think that a lot of organizations are just going to go back and they're not even going to revisit that plan, do that training. And I think we'll just be setting ourselves up for the next one.
You're probably right. I'm a super skeptic, and I always am ready to think the worst of people and or situations. But you know what? If 10% of people look at this situation and say, you know what, our organization can really benefit from this, frankly. Even if they look at it and say, you know what, I can stand out in my workplace because maybe no one's taking, this is a void, right? And no one's taking the initiative. Maybe it's an opportunity for me to take the initiative and stand out as an individual. if even 10% of those people do that, or 10% of organizations do that, they're going to be better off for it. I got to go back to this again. If you like, no leadership team wants to think about a crisis, but every leadership team thinks about risk. And if you can frame this as this is about reducing risk, and we're going to put our organization in a situation where we know how we're going to respond if these things happen. It's not about the random, the CEO died when the Coke machine fell over on top of them. Mm-hmm. That, it's just bizarre. Like, you think about the things that they're really most probable for the organization. Like, look at your business, look at operations. That's why having operations involved is so important. Where are the critical break points? Where are the points where if things went wrong, it would be either a danger to the community, it would be a danger to our business, danger to our organization, our ability to service the people that depend on us will be impacted. Identify those things. There's often not that many of them. Like, you could probably find in every organization, I bet you could find less than 10 that are those that fall into that category. Mm-hmm. And you just prepare for those. And you do it, and you don't have to, you want to revisit it because, I've been in situations where, crisis communications plan gets written, it gets put up on the shelf, but no one ever looked at it to say, can we actually implement that thing? Like, if there was a need, like oftentimes in plans, they have this, we should set up a crisis communications like war room. Mm-hmm. But no thought is given to where should that be? Where are the computers going to come from? Where do the phones come from?
Where's the electricity going to come from? Yeah.
Exactly. So think through those things. Write the plan, think through those things, and have it on the shelf. And I think if even a few more people do that, we'll be all better for it. But I would tend to agree with you. I think, like most things, people get through a bad situation. I think, thank God that's over. Back to
selling
whatever.
Widgets.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, a couple, I reached out online to some communications folks and said, share your tips. So I want to read off a few of these and have you just kind of like a little bit of a lightning round to kind of end things up, and you can just give us your reaction to some of these comments. The first one was, don't respond to rumors and speculation in your communications.
Yeah, we generally say not. Like, we want to keep track of those things to see what's being said. And I think you want to, in your communicate, if there was a rumor out there that was affecting you, I don't want to repeat the rumor, but I may want to structure in my communications facts that undercut the rumor without actually speaking to it directly.
Right. Another one is, sometimes people have communications scope creep, and now that they get kind of used to the idea of communicating and they're kind of enjoying it, and they turn themselves into like a mini CNN. The comment was, corporate communications is not the news media. Keep your updates limited to what's relevant for your customers.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier about how there may be a bit of over communication happening. Think about what are your people and your stakeholders need to hear from you, and be very tight and strategic about what are you saying, and say it in a way they're going to most likely hear it.
Corporate communications experts are not doctors. and because we're having a health issue again, and it goes to the scope creep, people are taking on the role of public health, and again, they're saying, is this a mistake, or is this something people should be doing? What do you think?
I think the two have a role together. In fact, public health professionals have to be good communicators, I think, to be effective in their job. I think, though, the thing to think about from a communicator standpoint is making sure that everything you're saying is 100% accurate. And that's why integrating the communicator with the people who are the experts is really critical. Like, oftentimes when you're dealing, especially with technical or scientific topics, what sounds good from a communicator standpoint may not be accurate, and so make sure the two are tied together.
So, given we're talking a lot about the functions, the role, how do you craft messages, deliver them, make decisions. We're still dealing with human beings at the end of the day who are a little frazzled, who are having a lot of demands on them, who are probably working from home with kids running around. What would be your advice as, one of the guys like me with more gray hair popping in, and we've been in this business a while? what would be some of your advice for them to take care of themselves from a mental health standpoint in the middle of a situation that we might really just be in the beginning phase of?
You know what? The number one thing is get sleep, and take two things: to get sleep and take a break. I remember Bill Clinton once said, you cannot make good decisions if you are tired. And in fact, just recently I saw a study that showed that somebody who gets 6 hours of sleep a night over an extended period of time has this slow degradation of decision making that's the same as if someone had not slept for something like 2 days. And you just don't realize it. So, which is hard to do in a crisis, but it's important to get enough rest. And I'm like the worst person to talk about that because I don't nearly get as much sleep as I should. But it is really critical to help decision making. And I think taking time away from the thing you're managing is really important. You have to build a break in there and just sort of shut it off, because you will get into a mode where you're so close to everything, you start losing that perspective and distance that a good communicator should bring to any situation. So it's important to build those breaks into the schedule as you're managing the situation.
That's great advice. Once I publish this podcast later today, I'm going to head out for a walk, hit the trails out here, and do some walking. I find, to me, that helps me clear my head. You're sort of out in nature. I'm not really dealing, I'm not within a meter of other people. And it really kind of allows you to kind of think and reset a little bit. It's like just that walking piece is really key for me. Do you still wear a Fitbit? Are you still a Fitbit guy?
I am, yeah.
Do you have the one that can you track your sleep with it?
I can, although I don't always do that.
It's horrifying to look at in the morning. Oh my God.
I know.
Because I'm thinking I'm getting this great. It's like 5.5 hours of sleep. Jeez. So a couple quick things before we wrap up.
Yeah.
What do you think about companies that are, and I've seen a couple communications or marketing kind of quote unquote experts on LinkedIn in the last couple of days saying this is the time that you should be marketing. This is the time where you should be selling to people. People are sitting there at home waiting for your message. What's your gut reaction to that?
Oh, that's a terrible idea. I think what you have to do is know that there's a time for everything, and you have to be thinking about your audience. Like, what do they need right now? And they probably don't need like another MyPillow right now. Like they need like reassurance. They need to know like what you're doing to help them, not selling them stuff.
Sorry. MyPillow. That's great. Oh, Jesus. So don't use this as an opportunity to sell, because it can come off as tone deaf, right? At the
or
at
like
best.
you're taking advantage of a situation. Like it's terrible idea.
And so related, but not like, again, not to exploit the situation, but you talked earlier about if this situation is handled properly, and if you can look out over time, and if you can realize that this will pass someday, and we'll get back to a sense of normalcy, that a crisis like this can actually be turned into an opportunity for your organization or for your career long term. We'll just leave with a couple parting thoughts about that. How can you turn this crisis situation into an opportunity for your company or for yourself?
I'll be honest. The thing that you can do most is internally focusing, making sure that your people know that you're there for them and that you're doing the things for them they need, and you're being attentive to their the stress they're under. Because outward facing, a success here is not screwing up, right? And because at the end of the day, a month from now, 6 months from now, no one's going to remember all the stuff you said about COVID-19. What they will remember is, were you there to help me when I needed it? Did the service I get from you continue? Were you reasonable and accommodating given the stresses that I'm under as I dealt with you? They'll remember that, but they're not going to remember the communications itself. And so not screwing up is a success. You can deepen the relationship you have with the clients you have or the customers you have. To an extent, but I think what you want to do is you want to avoid mistakes, strengthen your internal relationships, if you can be a good company, and some organizations are cutting customers' breaks. They're giving them more time to pay bills, or they're, being lenient with the timing of when things are due. Those things people will remember. Again, I guess, it comes full circle back to crisis communications is not about just making up a bunch of words. It's about figuring out meaningful things you're going to do to manage the crisis, and then communicating them in effective ways to the audiences you're trying to reach. And if you're doing that, you're going to succeed.
Well said. Thanks very much, brother. I appreciate you doing this.
My pleasure.
All right. All the best for the rest of the day, and hope you and your family stay well.
Thanks, Warren.
Take care. Big thank you once again to Heather and to John for taking the time to speak with me. Hopefully there were a few ideas in there that you can use for your business, association, company to help you communicate more effectively in these very, very interesting times. Thank you once again to you for listening. And if you haven't taken an opportunity to do so yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe to the show, or leave a comment or a rating. Helps other people to find the show. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.